You've described WikiLeaks as untraceable and uncensorable. What do you mean by that?
Well, nothing in this world is guaranteed for sure. But within that, we have put together an infrastructure using technical and legal techniques to really make it hard to trace people and make it hard to take down our material once it's published. And to date, we've had a 100% success rate. So that basic idea and intention is comprised of a number of specific ways of doing things. So for untraceability, this means people send us material in the post in a particular way, engaging in particular procedures, which makes it effectively impossible to trace. Or it means they submit material to us online and bounce the information through dozens of computers around the world, each computer encrypting its transmissions before it connects to another computer. So in this way, discarding identities as the information flows around the world. As it flows through different countries, we make sure it flows through Sweden and Belgium. And these two countries have specific source protection laws. In Sweden, as part of the Swedish Constitution, the Press Freedom Act, and in Belgium, a specific law dealing with the communications protections between a source and a journalist using any means whatsoever, including electronic transmissions. For publication, this means housing our servers in many different jurisdictions, such that any sort of interim attack on us, interim injunction, is not going to take the information down entirely. It may knock it out here, it may knock it out there. But we can put up servers and gain support and respond legally fast enough such that the information is not going to be removed from the public. And that has been what has happened to date. We've never lost a court case in any jurisdiction. Important thing to remember. But there have been interim attempts to injunct us. And while those interim attempts have gone on, we have managed to keep publishing.
How many documents of real value have you been able to accept and publish?
Well, it's hard to know how many real value. I mean, this is in the eyes of the beholder. To us, all information that is true has value eventually. It may only be a very small value to someone somewhere, but getting that information into the historical record, padding out the historical record, provides a sort of richness to every other bit of information in the historical record. So if you're talking about things which have clearly changed outcomes of elections or clearly introduced some law reform or clearly brought perpetrators to trial, then this is in the hundreds, somewhere in the hundreds. For the clearly changing governments or elections or having ministers deposed, this is maybe half a dozen to 10, something like that.
That's the power of information. It's an old truism, isn't it? And this is such a modern, ultra-modern form of getting it out. It must frighten a lot of establishments and authority, and especially governments. What governments have been successful in blocking it? In blocking WikiLeaks?
The governments that have clearly tried to interfere with readers' ability to look at what we publish and leakers' ability to give us stuff, China is the worst offender. China has the most aggressive, sophisticated sort of interception technology that places itself in between every reader inside China and every information source outside China. And so we've been fighting a running battle to make sure our information can get through. So there's all sorts of ways that Chinese readers can read our site. But the first thing that they try doesn't work. The first thing you would imagine doing, just go to wikileaks.org, that doesn't work. But variations on that do work. Iran has blocked us as well for a period. However, we are now unblocked in Iran. The Australian government has added us to their list of secret internet sites that are to be blocked once a national sort of filtering system is put into place. That national filtering system has not yet been put into place, but if it is, we'll be on the list.
That's the only Western government, is it?
There's also Germany. Has done a similar thing to Australia. They're in a similar position where they're trying to get up this national censorship system. It looks like it's not going to pass constitutional review. It looks like it won't get up. But something important to understand is what happens in the West is privatised censorship. So, like most other institutions in the West, censorship has been privatised, and that means that big corporations go through the court system to get injunctions and use the coercive power of the state, the ability to deploy armed police to force a court order. They use the court apparatus to do that. There's other ways censorship occurs in the West, through economic pushes and so on. But to give a specific example, a private bank, it deals with wealthy private clients, minimum account balance of $1 million, hides their assets around the world to make sure creditors, ex-wives, police, tax department and so on can't get them. We revealed their trust structures in the Cayman Islands, the beneficiaries, who set up the trust, how much money was in it, and so on. And they attacked us in the United States.
In the courts?
In the courts. So it's a Swiss Cayman operation using US federal law to try and attack us. They attacked the main registration URL that people are familiar with, wikileaks.org, because one of the companies involved in registering that was based in California. Right. And through that interim injunction, they did take that down for 10 days. Now, of course, we were still publishing on all our other URLs, still publishing successfully out of Sweden, but the thing that people were most familiar with was no longer available. And we then responded with a coalition of 20 lawyers and managed to turn that around. So quite an interesting result. It's not that the US justice system brings justice. It's not that the US justice system is always unjust, but you have to bring justice to the US justice system. And if you have a big enough coalition with enough money, you can force a good verdict out of it. But the initial verdict by the same judge was that we were to be shut down.
It's interesting you mentioned justice there, because I was going to ask you where the idea of WikiLeaks came from, but I mean, having the sense I get from you is that you've been using the technology to mine this information, especially within authority, for quite a long time. But there's really something, there's another element to it. There is an element of justice seeking about WikiLeaks, it seems to me, almost a moral element. I won't go as far as saying as a crusade, but there is a passion about it that's not just simply transparency. There's something else.
No, the goal is justice, the method is transparency. It's important not to confuse the goal and the method. So what I observed by looking at how the press worked and how successful activist campaigns worked is a very cheap and effective way of getting justice was finding information that people were spending effort on concealing and revealing it. Why do people spend effort on things? Well, because they believe it's going to benefit them. So when organizations spend effort to conceal something, they are making a statement. They're giving off an economic signal that if that information is revealed, it's going to have an effect. Well, otherwise, why would you spend the work? So in many of those cases, the effect that it will have is a push to reform the organization that is concealing some kind of abuse or some plan for some future abuse. And so by selectively going after that information, as opposed to all the other sorts of information out there, which there are a vast amount, we are able to selectively bring about just change.
The arrival of WikiLeaks coincides with a whole almost a sense of permanent war. The term permanent war, perpetual war, is constantly used now in the United States, where we have two wars running together, and other secret wars. In the information that you have revealed on WikiLeaks about these so-called endless wars, what has been the real high-value material that has come out that has given people, ordinary people if you like, the kind of information upon which they can then act?
Looking at the enormous quantity and diversity of these military or intelligence apparatus insider documents, what I see is a vast, sprawling estate, what we would traditionally call the military intelligence complex or military industrial complex, and that this sprawling industrial estate is growing, becoming more and more secretive, becoming more and more uncontrolled. This is not a sophisticated conspiracy controlled at the top. This is a vast movement of self-interest by thousands and thousands of players all working together and against each other to produce an end result, which is Iraq and Afghanistan and Colombia and keeping that going. So what I see is we should, we often deal with tax havens and people hiding assets and transferring money through offshore tax havens. So I see some really quite remarkable similarities. Guantanamo is used for laundering people to an offshore haven, which doesn't follow the rule of law that we would normally expect. A tax haven is used for hiding people's assets, laundering people's assets through a jurisdiction which doesn't follow the rule of law that we would expect in our home countries. Similarly, Iraq and Afghanistan and Colombia are used to wash money out of the US tax base and back.
Arms companies,
yeah. And the generals and so on, which are, if you like, non-profit versions. So that you can't just, or you can't always pull out $2 billion from the US tax base and just say, hey, let's give it to an arms company straight away with no expectation of doing any work. But if you say this $2 billion has got to go into Colombia, but the Colombian government has to buy US arms, and those arms have to be of a particular type, particular specification that only one of these arms companies has, then that's just a way of laundering this back into the United States.
And what you're saying is that money and money-making is at the center of modern war, and it's almost self-perpetuating.
Yes, and it's becoming worse. The number of private companies that sprung up around Iraq, the number of private companies that are now supporting the National Security Agency, this has increased 100 times in the past 10 years, the number of companies. So now you have a school, a feeding school that is feeding off the US tax base and is a lobby to make sure that those wars go on. And you have two sorts of lobbies. You have offensive lobbies and defensive lobbies. So an offensive lobby tries to get new money that it didn't have before by lobbying the levers of government. And a defensive lobby makes sure that companies continue to receive the money that they've been getting before. So now we're in a position in the United States where we have both enormous offensive lobbies and enormous defensive lobbies. But the defensive lobbies always fight harder. They fight to keep the expectation of the money flow going. And that apparatus has been built up in the past 10 years, and I think it's going to be extremely difficult to dismantle.
What was your reaction when you first saw the Apache video that is now infamous?
When I first saw this, we didn't know that there were journalists in it. We didn't know who they were. We didn't know the circumstances. We knew this was a tape of a helicopter attack, and otherwise nothing. So I could immediately see that this was, a visceral attack on people walking in a street in a relaxed manner. But I didn't know, were they armed? Were they really the bad guys? They seemed incredibly relaxed. It seemed like this was an attack that was very provocative. So if these people were insurgents, then they were insurgents having a break playing on the street in a suburb. But as we dug deeper and deeper, the situation became more and more appalling. So we found that clearly nearly all of these people were not armed. Clearly there were two cameramen there holding cameras, not arms. These cameramen turned out to be Reuters news reporters. Then looking at this wounded man crawling on the curb, we could, spending more time in the detail, it was clear that there was no arms being picked up, that he was just being rescued by a passerby.
Could you hear the voices? Could you hear the voices from the helicopter at this point?
Yeah, we could hear the voices from the helicopter, and sort of the grotesque language that soldiers have. What really struck me was not this very dark, grotesque humour. I can accept that people exercise black humour, very black humour sometimes in war. Rather, it was another day at the office feel to
routine.
all the proceedings, how routine it was to kill these 18 to 26 people, and that a whole street covered with bodies. The reaction to that was nice. This tape, for me and the other people involved, made nice a dirty word. So we just couldn't see something as being nice anymore when a whole street covered with carnage is nice.
Nice, yeah. The reaction. Now let me ask you, what did you make of the reaction to it in the media, the mainstream media reaction to the release of this video?
We've been involved in, obviously, many different stories that have produced fallout in the United States and in other countries. But this one was of a degree and of about a specific issue that we were able to sort of plot how all this unfolded and blew out and what the back reaction was. So initially, on the TV networks, there was an attempt to immediately downplay this. So, for example, CNN, Wolf Blitzer, they only showed, they took the first segment, which is not the most appalling one, the first attack, and then blanked out all the shooting, and then said this was out of sympathy or deference to the families. But there's no blood here, you can just see dust coming up. And then immediately started apologising for the military, saying, "Oh well, it's hard for our soldiers," and a reminder that war is difficult. No condemnation, not even any request for an inquiry, which is the sort of neutral response. Well, we don't want to blame people before all the facts are in, although actually if you see the video, you've got most of them. But we want to know everything about this. We want this inquiry to be opened. We want a full disclosure. We want to know why this video was withheld from Reuters for so long. So we want to know, were the children who were wounded compensated? Did they live? All these things would sort of been sort of natural reactions. Did not take place in the broadcast networks. Then, for CNN and NBC, there was, I think, a sort of internal revolt by journalists who were seeing other journalists mowed down in the streets of Baghdad. So a pushback against the editorial management decision to treat it so briefly and in such a biased way. So the next day saw a sort of richer discussion. And then it flipped. Then enormous editorial space, both in the printed press and in TV press, opened up for military apologists. And no space opened up for anyone else, including people with new facts, including the soldiers on the ground who were there, the only English-speaking witnesses, the only US witnesses and the only soldiers speaking. Those people couldn't get into the mainstream press and couldn't get onto TV.
Talk about the one soldier who, his name was McCord, is that right? Yeah. One of the soldiers on the ground who was one of those you see arriving at the van.
Ethan McCord.
Ethan McCord.
Is a soldier about 30 years old, was in the ground unit that was being serviced, if you like, by the Apaches in the sky. And they marched in and arrived to where the bodies were in the shooting up van. And Ethan heard the child crying in the van hysterically and pulled out the girl, saw the boy and thought the boy was dead. Took the child away from the van to a sort of intermediary location and then went to look for anyone else in the van and just saw the boy was just breathing and pulled him out. So he ended up being covered with the blood of his children. And he was quite disturbed by this event, and he got in contact with us immediately after the video was published, and he produced a statement of a letter of apology to this family. Of course, he wasn't involved directly with killing them, but indirectly. I mean, it was his unit that was being serviced by this Apache, and indirectly that he was part of the U.S. Army in Iraq. But he says that that he complained to his superiors about this event, and they just told him to stop being a pussy and to suck it up. And he's tried quite hard to draw attention to what happened in the mainstream, to get the mainstream press interested in it. Within 2 days of us revealing the material. So why it was still newsworthy. So there can't be any excuse in the US press to, well, the moment had passed and therefore, okay, yes, his story is interesting, but the moment has passed. Because at the very same time that he was trying to get his story across, editorial space was being given to military apologists who were just, war is hard and it's difficult.
These things happen. And you didn't show the full context, and they were shooting that morning, so on and so on.
Yeah. And, soldiers, it's difficult for soldiers, psychological, whatever. Not new facts. Whereas this soldier had new facts about what had happened then and an incident that happened immediately after.
I mean, what was interesting about him, he also had an overview, and he described what had happened that day as a common occurrence. And he talked about if there's any kind of threat or perceived threat to American soldiers, they would let everybody have it. He said, let all the motherfuckers have it at 360 degrees.
That's right. If there was an IED,
if there was an IED,
if he was instructed by his commanding officer that if an IED goes off anywhere in the street, then 360-degree rotational fire and just take out everyone, women, children, everyone gets it. I I guess, to try and act as a disincentive for the local population for supporting any IED placement. And that's what happened.
Yes,
I mean, it's not that he was told that and it didn't happen, but rather that happened and he was instructed. So he and some other soldiers in this unit who didn't like that instruction apparently fired high when those orders came, when an IED went off and they were instructed to fire those orders.
What do the leaks around this issue tell you about whether this particular incident was, as the US government claims, an aberration or not?
What we've seen in other leaks, I mean, just a vast number of these type of incidences. Now, when I say these type, what I mean is indiscriminate attacks on civilians. Not deliberate attacks on civilians, it's important to make clear, but just not giving a damn, not caring whether they are or whether they aren't. Sometimes occasional deliberate attacks on civilians, but those do seem to be rare in the record. But just, maybe they are, maybe they're not, but we want to shoot. And so go for it. Now, Ethan McCord and one of his fellow soldiers who were in that ground unit, they say that they were surprised it was this video that leaked, because there were many, many worse incidences, and this was a sort of everyday occurrence. It's not every day that journalists are killed. Although I did read the statistic that there have been 7 Reuters journalists killed in Baghdad, and all of them were killed by US military fire. But probably the only reason we are talking about this now is because there were 2 journalists there, and they were sort of trackable, and Reuters put in a Freedom of Information Act request. Whereas if they weren't journalists, if they were just regular citizens of Baghdad, we wouldn't even be talking about it. The material just would have been buried. There would have been no internal investigation at all, which prompted the eventual leaking.
So this is a kind of tip of an awful iceberg in many ways, isn't it? Because a war like Iraq and a war like Afghanistan, if not directed at civilians, civilians become the casualties. They're civilians' wars in a sense, aren't they?
There's this old statement that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And you can see from this video that when you're in an Apache with a zoom lens that can show you people's face from 1 mile up in the sky, and you have a 30mm cannon, and you shoot, and there's no effect against you, you can't even hear the screams. And when you get back to base, there's no discipline procedures against you. That when this happens every day, for days, for a year, of course, it's incredibly corrupting. And these people are shot in the same way that the everyday person walks over ants on the street, because they just seem to be irrelevant. They don't complain. There's no discipline procedure. And so as the war goes along, civilians do become just something to get rid of, because they're annoying or have no concern over. And while there are while some of these civilian massacre cases do achieve prominence, and then do find genuine concern by some of the higher generals or by other groups looking into them, that's not what we see for the everyday cases of civilian kills. And we have acquired records of 6 years worth of civilian kills for Iraq and Afghanistan. And not just the big ones, where there's 100 people killed or 20 people killed, where there is some investigation or publicity sometimes, but rather these sort of everyday incidences where a man might be, in one case in Afghanistan, a man is seen to be running away after US soldiers approach, and they try and shoot him. The guns jam, so he's running towards the village. So what do? The guns have jammed. They get the artillery, and they shell him. Just one man. They launch shells towards him. They overshoot, hit the village, and they kill a 5-year-old boy. So there's hundreds and hundreds of those small incidences which sort of reveal the squalor of war at a microscopic detail. It's not always these big kill events. It's these little events where there's a lack of concern and care about the sort of lethal engagement or the use of lethal force. Another example from Afghanistan is the American troops going through an area. They're not receiving fire, but they see some unexploded ordnance. They see a 1.5 meter shell just sitting there in a sort of dusty area. And could it be a booby trap? Possibly. Could be a booby trap. Might not. I mean, they could just walk past. What should they do? Should they shoot it? Should they call in their bomb disposal squad, which is what you would normally do, and have it taken care of? No, they call in airstrike instead to take out just this one unexploded shell. Now, presumably, that these are guys in Afghanistan. They're bored. They want to sit on. They want to see what an airstrike's like up close. It's very easy. It's in the daytime. So they call an airstrike. The airstrike overshoots. The shell hits a village. So this is sort of just a lack of concern, a lack of care.
Are these particular incidents from the documents that you've released in July?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and there's hundreds and hundreds like that.
Can you just describe almost the panorama of these documents? They're across Afghanistan and Iraq.
So for Afghanistan, this is 91,000 reports by troops on the ground and by some intelligence people back at the base. These are done just after an event happens or are updated during the course of a day. So they're sort of raw data before Pentagon spin doctors have had a chance to massage it. Although that said, sometimes troops don't put things in there that might incriminate them either. And for Iraq, this is 490,000 reports over the same period.
490,000?
490,000 over the same period of time.
That's a hell of a leak.
Yeah, that's a really extraordinary thing. This is the most finely detailed history of war that has ever been disclosed. Besides times, locations, kill counts, although the kill counts are sometimes massaged, but kill counts, people detained, what happened from the US troops' point of view. Now, they're not reliable narrators, but you can't hide everything when you're producing so much detail so quickly. And, it's just extraordinary. So we wrote a computer program to add up all these kill counts. And so for Afghanistan, this is in the hundreds of thousands.
Hundreds of thousands?
Hundreds of thousands. It's important to remember this wasn't just we got an aggregate figure of 100 thousands. This hundreds of thousands is a result of adding up all the individual cases which are documented. So the individual cases, the highest kill count was 480 or so, related to a stampede that occurred on a bridge.
480 people were killed.
Checking this in the news reports, it seems like it was more like 1,000 people were killed, but in the internal US military reporting, it's 480 people who were killed. But that's the single highest event. That's a sort of a bit unusual. And the next one down was a US sweeping operation that killed about 300. Some of these events are, on the surface, disturbing. So the highest kill count event in Afghanistan killed 181 people in a US operation led by Canada called Operation Medusa. in December 2006, and that kill count of 181, there was only one wounded.
One wounded.
One wounded. It says no civilians were killed and there were no captures. So if we then look at what was the sort of military hardware deployed, so it speaks about some ground force sweep and so on, a couple of people being killed there, but nearly everyone who is listed being killed was killed by an AC-130 gunship. So this is, an AC-130 is a big cargo plane which is being converted to be decked out with machine guns and tank guns and
so saturation fire from that.
From high up, but it's a plane that's moving. I mean, it's not exact. And in the course of 3 hours, 62 people are described as being killed by this. And then there's also an unexplained missing 90 or so people. How they are killed is not established in the report, but they are listed as having been killed in 2 places.
And do they call these all Taliban, the enemy?
They're all called the enemy. Looking at that Operation Medusa kill, that broader operation, quite interesting. I mean, I hadn't heard about this before, but this was the biggest, according to the Canadian military, the biggest operation in Afghanistan post-invasion. But Afghanistan wasn't on people's radar in December 2006. Iraq was. But during that week, they say that they killed about 1,000 Taliban. But actually, what happened is that this was in a region of about 20k out of Kandahar, where there's lots of vineyards, and there was the government installed by US forces post the 2001 invasion had become extremely corrupt, and the local people had grown to support the Taliban in a sort of united effort to clean out this government. And then when US and Canadian and, when ISAF, sort of the Allied forces,
NATO.
The Western forces came in, these people, not just Taliban, there do seem to have been Taliban there, but the local population were supportive. And so the men in the vineyards, the workers in the vineyards, were killed along with these others. And it seems to, if we read the press reports at times, some press say it's 50-50, 50% Taliban, 50% local people. It's pretty hard to gauge from the on-the-ground reporting. But we look at events like this leaked document shows, and we see something pretty disturbing. A lot of people killed, very little time, using indiscriminate fire, no investigation into 181 people being killed, the biggest kill on a single event in Afghanistan post 2001. It doesn't smell right.
Yeah, I suppose those doing the killing, who I'm assuming they regard everybody as the Taliban or as insurgents.
Well, the pattern.
So who isn't? Children.
The pattern we see in Iraq and Afghanistan, the very clear pattern, and it's not just me who sees this, but other war reporters, is that anyone who's a man and dead is an insurgent. That's how they're always listed on the reports, and it's only after there's some investigation, usually stimulated by the press or by a competing military reporting on it, that then there's a sort of pull down from that number.
Yeah.
So, any man who is dead is insurgent or Taliban. Children, if their bodies are whole enough to see, and remember things like 30mm cannon fire will decimate a body, are listed as children, so they're not listed as insurgents, and women can go either way. And so, as an example, if we look at Kunduz, this is an airstrike that occurred in Afghanistan last year, where it was called in by the German military. Petrol tankers about 3 kilometres away from German military positions had been put in a riverbed, and the local people were unlading the petrol from them, taking this off. Now, the allegation is that the Taliban hijacked these petrol tankers and were then giving the petrol to the local population, which is quite possibly true. I mean, maybe they're trying to curry favour of the local population, but the reality is there was over 100 people clustered around this tanker taking the petrol, and they weren't going anywhere, they're sitting there. So airstrike was called in and killed most of these people. Yet, when we look at the internal military reporting by the United States, what we see is, in these leaked reports, 57 insurgents killed. When we look at the internal military reporting for the collateral murder, this Iraq massacre, which included 2 Reuters journalists that happened in July 2007, what we see is 14 people killed, and there were actually between 18 to 26 people killed, and all of them insurgents, except for 2 children who were wounded. And
so even the Reuters cameramen were
listed as insurgents.
Yeah.
Until Reuters came in contact and said, hey, where's our cameraman?
Yeah. I mean, for you to receive that volume of documentation suggests that there must be something of a rebellion going on within the system.
Yes. I mean, it's the one hopeful thing is, in fact, that there are good people in the US military. There are good people in military intelligence organizations. And some of those people have had enough. And so they provide us with evidence of abuse. And I mean, that's, it's sort of another way of being a conscientious objector. And in fact, arguably a far more powerful way of objecting to the war.
Yeah. And what about among journalists? Is there a rebellion amongst journalists? You said some time ago, I think, that journalists need to respect their readers and viewers. How do journalists, by and large, react to WikiLeaks? Of course, some are very impressed, obviously, but you've described, for example, the reaction in the United States with CNN and NBC and CBS and so on, as journalists being used to justify it. So how are journalists dealing with the arrival of WikiLeaks?
Yeah, a very interesting mixture. So, it seems like all the good journalists support us and all the bad ones don't. But of course, maybe that's just my interpretation based upon their support.
Probably a good interpretation.
But it does seem that the more accomplished and independent the journalists, the more they are likely to support us. The more they are able, in fact, the more established they are as an independent journalist with their own independent reputation, that they can choose to take from one newspaper to another. They can choose to take from one network to another if they're stuffed around. It seems like the more they are able to state their support for us, whereas the journalists who are not in that position of freedom, that are more part of the group of the company, that they're company men, they're more likely to be critical.
Because WikiLeaks is very threatening to systems. And the BBC is a system. The network making this documentary, ITV, is a system.
So individual journalists, as opposed to the organizations that they're working in, are supportive of us in that they may be able to collaborate with us or use our material. And that can be extremely important material. And some people have an ability to see that, and they want to help and so get that material out to the public, or bring extra angles in on it, or use their existing understanding to help flesh it out. So they see us as, as colleagues. And then we have a group that sees us as competition, that sees us as a threat. And in the regular sort of competitive sense, but also in that we are demanding certain standards, certain higher levels of information, harder to get information, and the use of primary sources in material that has been released in print. So that makes them have to work harder. So they see us as a threat. And then there's another group that appreciates what we're doing because we're drawing the fire. So we are the free press vanguard. We are the sort of defender of whistleblowers, and we move that whole field further out. And that creates a sort of a vacuum behind us into which these people can come, which doesn't have any fire, because we're attracting the opposition by pushing the envelope. And that's quite nice, because over the last 4 years we have been changing the standard. So to some degree we are now the status quo. We are something that exists. There's an economic and political and social niche.
You're the mainstream.
I won't go quite that far, but there's an understanding, a political and economic understanding that there is a place for WikiLeaks in this world, and that if we were to disappear, that would be something new.
It's quite interesting that how you've shifted in. I mean, here, the Guardian media pages every year lists the 100 most important media people. You've probably seen this. This year they've included you.
Yeah, this year 58, but last year we weren't in there at all. That's quite an improvement.
The fact that you're in there is interesting.
Very interesting. I mean, it's true we do have some influence, but I think it's also the case that those people in The Guardian, whoever put that list together, and I'm sure it's a totally accurate list, but I'm sure that's also a desire. There's a desire for us to be leading in that way, and that they want to support us and see that we do something beneficial for them, which is to open up this space.
I mean, there's clearly a big shift underway, and we've talked about this already. But the shift is from traditional, so-called mainstream journalism, to what has become known as citizen journalism. Is that a very significant shift now? Is the whole nature of journalism likely to change because of this trend?
It is changing, and the changes will be dramatic. But I'm not one to sell citizen journalism as being, at the moment, being a great answer yet. And because what I see in the alternative press is very little journalism going on. In fact, what I see is people taking the front page of the New York Times, using that as their issue of the day, and saying, I don't agree with it, or I do agree with it. And when our idea is that our material would spark tremendous amounts of citizen journalism, because all these people who write opinion pieces on blogs and so on, when given the complaint, why aren't you doing any real journalism? Why aren't you going and research or investigating something? They say, well, it takes a long time to build up sources, so we don't have anything new to talk about, so we have to just analyse what the mainstream press are doing. So, but we have produced hundreds of thousands or millions of pages of new source material that these people could analyse and could report, and it's extremely rare that they do. So the specific example that I like to use is we got hold of a classified US intelligence report into what happened in the war in Fallujah. So this was a left cause célèbre, that invasion of the town of Fallujah in Iraq in 2004. Of course, Iraq itself had already been invaded, but Fallujah was some kind of holdout to the new government that had been put in place by the United States, the Coalition Provisional Authority. And that the circumstances of that invasion was some US contractors who were going through this area had been killed, and anyway, so not wanting to go into the detail, but that was a very bloody invasion, and it ended up with a pullout and a re-invasion some 5 months later. So what were the circumstances? Everyone knew that all sorts of tragedy had occurred in that town. This report, in fact, revealed both how things progressed militarily, how things progressed politically, spoke specifically about Paul Bremer, who was the head of the Coalition Provisional Authority, the role of Al Jazeera in that town, the media war, as well as the on-the-ground war. The different tribal regions, classified secret via US Army ground intelligence. So we took this classified US intelligence report about Fallujah and released it. So all citizen journalists, academics, employed journalists could analyze it, write about it, call up the US military, ask them about it, ask the countries involved, human rights groups, what was going on, etc. This was the raw primary ingredient that you needed to actually do some journalism. And mailed this out to 3,500 people on our mailing list. And the result was not a single citizen journalist did anything. The first person to publish was a friend, Sean Waterman at UPI. He was the national security reporter. And then another 5 professional press journalists. Not all of them full-time journalists, some working for the Asia Times half-time and working for the Cato Institute half-time as an example of one of these 5.
Yeah.
But the bloggers, the political activists of all kinds, in fact, didn't do anything with this material.
So, I mean, that's interesting. So real information can almost paralyze, as if they don't know what to do with it.
Well, over time we are seeing that we're sort of training people up a bit. So it's getting better over time. People are starting to become used to this military information and nomenclature, understanding that when we release it is definitely true. But a very surprising effect. I mean, that report, as an example, it looked good. It wasn't just that it had important details. It wasn't too long. It was only
It was
30
accessible.
pages. It was accessible. It had a nice map of Fallujah on the front, split into tribal regions.
And no one picked it up.
No one picked it up. And eventually, professional press picked it up.
You're making some very serious enemies, not least of all a government engaged in 2 rapacious wars. How do you deal with what must be a sense of that danger? Do you ignore it, or do you accommodate it within yourself?
So, not at all. I think, a lot of people say we're very courageous in our work. And I wouldn't reject that label entirely. We're not uncourageous. But to me, courage is not the absence of fear at all. Courage is sort of the intellectual mastery of fear by understanding. So we just understand what the risks are, and having understood them, we're able to navigate the path through them. One of my good friends who's a reporter for the Standard newspaper in Kenya, investigative head, whenever he is about to publish a big story exposing the Kenyan government, and the newspaper was raided by the police a couple of years ago, he publishes, he goes to Tanzania, he waits to see what happens. Eventually it becomes clear what's going to happen, and he comes back. If he doesn't understand the risk, if he understands the risk and he sees that it's relatively low risk, then he publishes and he stays in Nairobi. And so that's how we work.
What do you do? Because you're, I would have thought, unlikely to go to the United States at the moment.
Well, in July of 2010, I had 3 speaking engagements in the United States. including one at the Investigative Reporters and Editors Conference in Las Vegas. A panel there with Scott Risen, New York Times National Security reporter, and Valerie Plame was also on the panel. I cancelled my visit to the United States because of some information that was coming out from our sources within the US administration saying that it would be a danger to me to go to the United States.
In the Pentagon recently, I asked the Assistant Secretary of Defense, Brian Whitman, this. I said, can you, as a senior official of the United States government, can you give a guarantee that the editors of WikiLeaks and the editor-in-chief himself, who is not American, that's you, are not in danger, that they themselves will not be subjected to the kind of hunt that we've read about in the media? And his reply in a nutshell, well, first of all, it's not my position to give guarantees on anything. I mean, how do you feel about that?
Well, it sounds like keeping all options on the table to me.
But they're not good options, are they? I don't want to dramatise this too much, but you're in a sort of unique position, in a way, aren't you? I don't think there's been a WikiLeaks before.
There hasn't, and they don't know how to deal with us. And there's no, I mean, something that has preserved us is that there's no, in the United States or in any other country, there is no department to deal with WikiLeaks.
Yeah.
Most of those government departments are split up into regional focuses. So there's no sort of specialist in dealing with what we are or understanding what we are or understanding how to deal with this. But, I mean, there are serious statements coming out of the US administration under the surface that imply that they would not follow the rule of law.
They would not follow the rule.
Implied that they would not follow the rule of law, and that is a serious matter.
There's a certain record there, yeah.
And there were senior figures like Cy Hirsch giving me warnings, a famous US national security reporter. And so, I mean, we listened to those warnings and took appropriate security precautions. That said, I think our political position in countries like United Kingdom, Australia, Iceland, Germany, and other countries with less strength is such that it is impossible to, arrest me here in the United Kingdom. Politically, it is just not possible to do that. Now, why some intermediary bureaucrat might do it and not understand the political risk, eventually the matter would be pushed up high enough, and people with better understanding of politics will go, do not do that. That's just going to create a terrible political dilemma for everyone concerned. Don't do it.
I note your preemptive strike in response when you posted on WikiLeaks a leaked Pentagon document that says that the US intelligence intends to destroy WikiLeaks, and the words used are that they would wanted to fatally marginalize the organization.
And destroy our center of gravity. By using sort of military language, which is what they say is the trust that sources and public have in us. If they can destroy that, then they can stop US military whistleblowers coming to us. And they say the word whistleblower. I mean, they're not talking about, or at least not just talking about unauthorized disclosures, which may or may not be revealing abuse. They are saying whistleblowers, people who reveal abuse. They give examples. Examples given are Guantanamo Bay, when we released the main manuals for this, which revealed that they are hiding people from the Red Cross, falsifying documents and so on. Fallujah and abuses that we revealed there, and a number of other cases. So they are upset with us because we are revealing abuses and embarrassing the United States military. So we released that report, which was written in 2008. We released this earlier in 2010. as maybe as a preemptive strike. I mean, it's putting them on notice, and by us releasing that, there is an understanding. That didn't come from nowhere. That report clearly came from some intelligence insiders in the United States. We have support inside the US intelligence community. So it is difficult and dangerous for people within the US intelligence community to try and investigate us, because there will be dissidents that will step forward and reveal that. So they have to tread very carefully.
What happens when you return to Australia, your homeland? Because when you went back recently, they took away your passport, saying that it was, worn and something, you perhaps needed a new one. But miraculously, you didn't need a new one. They gave it back to you sometime later.
Yeah, and just a little bit after that, they also searched my bags and made references to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Australian Federal Police, specific information that had to have come off their database file. So it's quite interesting. In Australia, I mean, there is a sort of patriotism in Australia that is proud of WikiLeaks and proud of me. And that is defensive. And as a result, there have been very positive articles in the Fairfax Press and in the Australian. So I'm told by my politically connected people in Australia that it would be extremely difficult to arrest me, detain me, or deport me, or our other volunteers in Australia. That said, there has been extensive spying on our people in that country, which I assume has been agreed to in some way by the Australian government, and we have some information about the Australian government being involved in that.
Is it hard after a while to keep these shadows at bay? Do you get used to them? You must say to yourself, look, I can't become paranoid about this. I'm going to live a normal life. Is that difficult?
Oh, it's become pretty easy. I mean, we have some security precautions, we have some security procedures, we have different people doing different things in different places depending on their need for security. For me, I mean, it doesn't matter if I'm followed around, provided I'm not meeting with a source.
Quite a few BBC journalists who have got in touch with me and want to talk about the pressure within the BBC. In other words, they represent the kind of rebellion that you're describing. What would you say to people like them in an institution like the BBC, or indeed journalists who are led by their conscience or just by their professional integrity within certain organisations? What would you say to them? What can they do?
Oh, when your stories are killed, get them to us and we'll publish them. It's the simplest one. Or when the primary source material is suppressed, get them to us. I mean, you don't have to leave the institution. You can work on the inside and on the outside and keep this line between the two invisible.
So what they can't get on air and what they can't get in the paper, give to WikiLeaks.
Yeah. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't. There's not so much career motivation to do that because you kind of stick your name on it at the time. But later on, maybe you can put your name on it. When you leave the institution.
What wouldn't you accept?
Yeah.
What wouldn't you publish? What leak wouldn't you publish?
Unlike every other news organisation, we say precisely in policy what we will and will not accept for the material that we publish. So we say to whistleblowers, we will take material that hasn't appeared before. It is being some force suppressing it, legal or threat of violence or being fired, and that is of diplomatic, political, ethical or historical significance, and that you didn't write yourself. So, provided it fits that, we will publish it. Now, we might go through some harm minimisation process in the interim. So the only forms that has taken is, as an example, the British National Party, when we published their secret membership list. We contacted all these people ahead of time and we said, oh, we're going to publish this in a few days. We're giving you the heads up, just in case this, your telephone number being public and so on causes problems. You go and sort it out. So that has always worked so far. We're aware of no instance where anyone has come to any sort of physical harm as a result of anything we've published. We are aware of quite a few results where people have been fired or lost elections as a result of things that we've published, but that seemed to be on the side of the angels. If at some stage that policy doesn't seem to be working, then we'll create a new policy. Remember, our goal is justice, our means is transparency. We don't confuse these two.
The propaganda efforts of governments has become vast. I read an AP investigation that said the US was had spent 4.7 billion over the last 5 years on basically winning hearts and minds, not of the enemy, but of its own people. I mean, this kind of information war, and General Petraeus in his counterinsurgency manual refers to wars of perception in which the media is one of the weapons. So information war has never been more important. But what happens when WikiLeaks runs into the United Kingdom, which has some of the most draconian secrecy laws in the world, such as the Official Secrets Act? Is it more difficult here to mine information?
We haven't found a problem publishing UK information. I mean, when we look at the Official Secrets Act labelled documents, we see they state that it is an offence to retain the information, and it is an offence to destroy the information. So the only possible outcome is that we have to publish the information.
And that's what you've done.
Which we have done on many, many occasions.
I noticed one of those that I had a personal interest in was one that from the Ministry of Defence, classified document that equated terrorists with investigative journalists as threats.
And Russian spies.
And Russian spies.
Yeah, as in fact, in many sections of that report, investigative journalists are the number one threat to the sort of information security of the Ministry of Defence. That was a 2,000-page document on how to stop leaks from the Ministry of Defence, which we leaked.
I didn't know whether to be offended or honoured.
Well, it's nice to be having an impact.